My name is Emily, and I thought buying my first home was the happiest moment of my life. But within days, the HOA president turned my dream into a nightmare. His charm, his rules, his power, everything was a trap, and I walked straight into it. The day I turned the key to my new home, I thought I had finally made it. Years of saving, endless late shifts, every sacrifice I had made brought me to that moment. A little white fence, a tidy yard, and a kind of quiet that felt almost unreal. I stood on the porch and breathed in the air like it was freedom. This was supposed to be the beginning of my new life. My dream home. My sanctuary. But almost immediately, I felt the cracks beneath the perfection. Every house looked like it belonged on the cover of a magazine, lawns trimmed like someone had measured each blade of grass, flowers exploding in perfect symmetry, driveways spotless as though no car had ever leaked a drop of oil. At first, I thought it was impressive. Later, I realized it was suffocating. The first envelope came within 24 hours. A violation notice. Trash bin left visible beyond approved hours. I stared at it in confusion. I had just moved in. I hadn't even finished unpacking my boxes. I told myself it was probably a clerical mistake. Then another notice came the next day. And another. Grass height exceeds regulation. Garden ornament not in compliance. Each one colder, more formal, each one carrying a fine I could barely afford. That's when I started noticing the eyes. Curtains shifted when I walked past. Neighbors smiled politely but never really spoke. One woman whispered when I passed, "Don't cross him." I wanted to ask who she meant, but something in her tone warned me not to. The truth became clearer when I went to my first HOA meeting. The clubhouse was filled with stiff chairs and the faint smell of disinfectant. Everyone sat silently as though waiting for permission to breathe. Then I saw him, Richard. The HOA president. He was in his mid-40s, perfectly dressed, with streaks of gray in his hair that made him look distinguished. His smile was warm, but his eyes were cold, sharp, assessing. The room shifted around him, like even the air bent to his control. When he spoke, his voice carried authority wrapped in charm. He welcomed me as the new homeowner, lingering on my name, drawing attention to me as though I were the guest of honor. "We're glad to have you here, Emily," he said. "I know the rules can feel overwhelming at first. If you need guidance, I'm always available." His words were honey, but something in the way he looked at me made my skin prickle. After the meeting, he approached me directly. Up close, his presence was overwhelming. "Don't let the letters get to you," he said. "You're new. Mistakes happen. I can help make sure the board doesn't come down too hard." The way he said it felt less like an offer and more like a warning. He wasn't telling me I had a choice. He was telling me he was the choice. Walking back home that night, I replayed the encounter in my head. His smile wasn't genuine. It was calculated. It reminded me of a predator baring its teeth, not to reassure, but to remind you it could bite. I remembered the whispers, the way neighbors avoided saying his name, the silence that fell when he walked into a room. He wasn't just a man managing rules. He was the rules. The next morning, I found another letter taped to my door. Unauthorized plantings in front yard. I laughed bitterly, I hadn't planted anything. But before I could even process it, my phone buzzed. A message from a number I didn't recognize. "If you need help with these violations, I can make them disappear. Richard." My stomach tightened. I had never given him my number. That evening, I caught him walking slowly past my house, his hands in his pockets like he belonged there. When our eyes met, he gave me a casual wave. It wasn't neighborly. It was a reminder. He was watching me, and he wanted me to know it. I tried to focus on normal things, unpacking, arranging furniture, hanging curtains. But every time I thought I could relax, another letter showed up. A bicycle leaning against the garage. Storage in view. A delivery box left too long on the porch. Exterior clutter. Even my curtains were non-compliant. It was relentless. I realized it wasn't about violations at all. It was about control. The neighbor's behavior only deepened the unease. A man across the street stopped me at the mailbox one afternoon. His voice was low, his eyes darting around nervously. "Don't let him think you're resisting," he muttered. "He doesn't like resistance." Then he walked away quickly, like even being seen talking to me was dangerous. Another woman avoided my greeting completely, her face pale as she hurried inside. Meanwhile, Richard's messages grew bolder. Compliments tucked inside reminders of power. "That dress looked good on you at the meeting. Don't stress, you're too pretty for that." His words made me feel exposed, but worse, they made me feel trapped. If I ignored him, the violations would continue. If I responded, I knew I'd only be feeding into his control. The breaking point came one night when a knock rattled my front door. I froze, staring through the peephole. Richard stood there, perfectly calm, as if midnight visits were nothing out of the ordinary. I didn't open the door, but his voice carried through anyway. "I just wanted to make sure you were settling in," he said. "I'd hate to see you overwhelmed." His tone was polite, but every word was sharpened. He wanted me to know he could show up whenever he wanted, no invitation required. When he finally walked away, I bolted the locks, turned off the lights, and sat in the dark, listening to my own heartbeat. The realization sank into me like ice. I hadn't bought a home. I had bought myself a prison. And Richard was holding the key. I should have been happy. I should have been free. But instead, I had walked straight into a trap. I told myself I wouldn't let Richard get under my skin. He was just a man with too much power in a neighborhood that took itself too seriously. That's what I repeated every time another violation letter arrived or another text from him lit up my phone. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. He had already gotten under my skin. He was everywhere, in every rule, in every fine, in every sideways glance from my neighbors. The pressure grew heavier each week. One morning, I walked outside to find a letter stuck to my door in bright red ink, "Final warning. Repeated violations." My stomach dropped. I had been careful. Too careful. Nothing was out of place. Still, the letter accused me of storing trash improperly, of failing to maintain the lawn, of willful disregard for HOA standards. It ended with a line that chilled me: "Further non-compliance may result in escalation, including legal action or property lien." I gripped the paper so hard it tore in my hands. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. "Richard again. Don't panic. These things can be smoothed over. Why don't we talk tonight?" My first instinct was to ignore him, but something inside me whispered that ignoring him would only make things worse. I replied with one word: "Fine." That evening, he showed up at my door dressed like he had come from a business dinner, his cologne heavy, his smile disarming. He stepped inside without waiting for me to invite him. "You're doing well, Emily," he said, his eyes scanning the living room as though inspecting it for flaws. "But the board, they like to make examples. You don't want to be the example." He sat down like he owned the place, crossing his legs casually. "The good news is, I can protect you from all that." His words unsettled me, but his tone carried the same charm I'd seen him wield at the meeting. When he leaned closer, lowering his voice, I felt the trap closing in. "You don't need to fight me. Let me handle it for you." And then, almost casually, his hand brushed mine. I should have pulled away. I should have thrown him out of my house. But the fear of what he could do, the exhaustion of constant harassment, and the strange magnetism of his confidence tangled together until I froze. That night, I let him kiss me. That night, the line blurred between resistance and surrender. In the days that followed, things changed. The letters stopped. My yard was suddenly in compliance. My mailbox was quiet, my fines disappeared. Neighbors still avoided me, but I noticed the way they looked at me, like they knew something I didn't want them to know. Richard had made me untouchable, but at a price I didn't fully understand yet. He began stopping by more often. At first, it was under the excuse of checking on me. Then it was just because he wanted to. His texts grew more personal, less about violations and more about me. Compliments, jokes, late-night messages. When he kissed me again, I didn't resist. By the end of the month, I was in an affair with the married man who ran my neighborhood like a king. For a brief moment, I convinced myself it was worth it. My life was calm. No more warnings, no more fines, no more threats of liens or lawsuits. Richard made me feel like I had someone powerful on my side. I let myself believe he was protecting me, that maybe he wasn't just using me. Maybe he actually cared. That illusion cracked the day I saw another woman leaving his car. She was young, maybe younger than me, her face pale as she hurried across the street without looking back. Richard watched her go, his expression unreadable, before driving off. When he came to see me later, I asked him who she was. He smiled and said, "Just a neighbor who needed help." The way he said it made my stomach turn. I realized then, I wasn't special. I wasn't the first. The unease grew when one of my neighbors, an older man named Harris, finally spoke up. He stopped me by the mailbox again, his voice low and urgent. "He's done this before," he whispered. "Women move in, he corners them. Some leave. Some don't get out so easy. Be careful." Then he walked away quickly, his shoulders hunched as if even speaking those words put him at risk. I wanted to deny it, but I couldn't. The way people looked at me, the silence at meetings, the coldness of Richard's wife when she passed me in the street, it all fit. I was just the latest in a long line of victims. The shift came slowly. Richard started asking for favors. Small things at first: show up to a meeting, support a proposal, vote with him when a decision came to the board. When I hesitated, he reminded me of how quickly fines could return. "You don't want the board against you again, do you?" he would say, his tone soft but his eyes hard. The more I resisted, the more the pressure built. One evening, he showed up with papers in hand. "These are the complaints the board has been stacking against you," he said, flipping through them. "If I weren't here, you'd be drowning in fines." He leaned close, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Don't make me reconsider protecting you." It was blackmail, wrapped in charm. He wanted control, and I had given him the opening. The violations returned the moment I pushed back. A notice for noise disturbance when I hadn't even been home. A complaint about weeds that didn't exist. A fine for improper lighting. It became obvious, if I didn't play along, he would destroy me. The worst moment came when he threatened me directly. We were in his office at the clubhouse, the door locked behind us. He placed his phone on the desk and slid it toward me. On the screen were messages I had sent him, texts that painted me as the willing other woman. "If you make this difficult, Emily, these go public. My wife sees them. The board sees them. The community will see them. What do you think they'll say then?" He leaned back, smug, as if he had already won. I felt sick. He had me trapped from every angle. If I fought, I lost my reputation. If I stayed quiet, I lost myself. I walked out of that office with my hands shaking, the sound of his voice echoing in my head. "You're mine now. Don't forget that." At night, I lay awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I had ended up here. I had come to this neighborhood for peace, for stability, for a home. Instead, I was living in fear, my life wrapped around the whims of a man who thrived on control. But fear has a way of burning itself into anger. And anger has a way of hardening into resolve. One night, sitting in the dark with another violation notice crumpled in my hand, I realized something. Richard thought he had me trapped. But he had left a trail. The texts, the favors, the threats, the inconsistencies in the board's records, there were cracks in his perfect control. Cracks I could use. I wasn't just going to escape his trap. I was going to turn it against him. I thought I had accepted my situation, but the truth is, I was only pretending. I kept telling myself I could manage Richard, that if I played along, I could keep the peace and survive in this neighborhood. But the more I tried to balance between silence and compliance, the more he pushed, and the more I realized survival was never enough for him. He didn't want me to live quietly. He wanted me broken. The first public attack came during a homeowners meeting. I had barely taken my seat when Richard's voice cut through the room. "We need to address repeated violations from one of our members," he announced, his eyes locking on mine. My pulse spiked. He pulled out a stack of papers, waving them like proof of a crime. Noise complaints, unauthorized modifications, consistent failure to meet standards. His voice grew louder, each word driving nails into my reputation. I stood, trying to defend myself, but the looks from the others silenced me. Some stared at me with pity, others with judgment, but no one spoke up. Richard leaned back, pretending to be fair. "Emily, we want to help you. But the board can only be so lenient." His tone was patronizing, like I was a child being scolded. When the meeting ended, whispers followed me out the door. By the next morning, rumors had spread. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid me. One muttered something under his breath as I passed, shaking his head like I was a disgrace. The shame weighed heavier than any fine. I felt poisoned by whispers I couldn't control, isolated in a community I had once dreamed of joining. And Richard made sure the pressure never stopped. The letters returned in full force, each one more outrageous than the last. Unapproved gatherings. Unsafe exterior decorations. Potentially hazardous shrubbery. They didn't even make sense anymore. I would have laughed if I hadn't been drowning in fines. My mailbox filled with threats, my front door was marked with warnings, and I couldn't walk outside without feeling the entire neighborhood was watching me through their windows. The financial strain was crushing. Each fine carried weight, stacking into thousands I couldn't afford. I called the HOA office, but Richard was the one who answered. His voice was smooth, almost amused. "You know I can make this all go away," he said. "But you're choosing to fight me. And you'll lose." I tried to pull back from him completely. No more texts, no more late-night visits. But when I stopped answering, he reminded me just how much power he held. One evening, a plain envelope appeared under my door. Inside were printed copies of our messages, screenshots of things I had written in moments of weakness. Some flirtatious, some desperate. My hands trembled as I flipped through them. Scrawled across the last page in his handwriting were the words, "Imagine what the board, or my wife, would think." I felt my stomach twist. He wasn't threatening me quietly anymore. He was laying the noose around my neck and daring me to fight. The breaking point came when he confronted me at my own home. I had just come back from work when he was already there, waiting at the edge of my driveway. He looked calm, confident, like someone certain of victory. "You can't shut me out," he said. "You owe me. Everything you have here, you have because of me. Don't forget that." His eyes locked onto mine, daring me to argue. I didn't. I walked inside, locked the door, and crumbled against the wall. For the first time since moving in, I considered leaving. Selling the house, abandoning the dream, running away. The thought made me cry, not because of what I would lose, but because that was exactly what he wanted. He had driven out others before me, I was sure of it. And if I left, I'd just be another name whispered about behind closed doors. Another victim no one dared defend. It was then I remembered what Harris, the neighbor, had said. "Some don't get out so easy." The way he said it haunted me. How many women had been trapped like me? How many had left in shame, their reputations shredded, their finances ruined? And how many had stayed silent, letting Richard keep his throne? The anger hit me like fire in my chest. For weeks, I had lived in fear, paralyzed by his control. But fear can only stretch so far before it snaps. That night, I pulled out every violation letter, every text message, every threatening note, and laid them across my table. It wasn't just harassment. It was a pattern. A weapon he had been using for years. I started digging. Quietly, carefully. I went through the HOA's financial reports, available to residents though most never bothered to look. What I found made my blood run cold. Expenses that didn't add up. Payments to consultants that had no names attached. Repairs billed to community funds but never completed. Richard wasn't just a bully with rules. He was a thief, bleeding the neighborhood dry while keeping everyone too afraid to ask questions. The deeper I looked, the more evidence I found. Old meeting minutes where Richard had pushed through decisions with little explanation. Sudden resignations of board members replaced by people who always voted his way. Even emails forwarded anonymously to my inbox, suggesting he had used HOA money for personal expenses. Piece by piece, the image of Richard's control sharpened into something darker. He wasn't just abusing me. He was abusing everyone. but still, I couldn't shake the fear. What if I exposed him and no one believed me? What if he turned it all back on me? The doubts gnawed at me, keeping me awake at night. But then one evening, I heard shouting outside. Peeking through my blinds, I saw Richard arguing with a woman in the street. His wife. Her voice was sharp, angry, but his was calm, dismissive. She stormed off into the night, leaving him standing alone, his mask cracking for just a second. That's when I realized something important. He wasn't untouchable. He was vulnerable. The next morning, I found another violation notice. This one accused me of maintaining a hostile environment. I stared at the words, and instead of fear, I felt something different. Resolve. If he wanted a war, I would give him one. But it wouldn't be his kind of war. Not whispers, not threats, not fear. My war would be truth. I gathered everything. Copies of letters, printouts of texts, photos of notices taped to my door. I kept screenshots of every message he sent, even the ones that made me feel sick to read. I started reaching out to other homeowners quietly, testing the waters. At first, most were hesitant, terrified of retaliation. But once I showed them my evidence, a few began to open up. Stories spilled out, stories of intimidation, of finds that appeared out of nowhere, of Richard's friendly visits that had turned into something darker. I wasn't alone. I had never been alone. He had done this to others. He had left a trail of victims who were too scared to speak. But together, we could be something different. Together, we could be the crack that shattered his perfect facade. That night, as I sat surrounded by the weight of his threats and the strength of my evidence, I whispered to myself, it's his turn now. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, I felt free. Not because he had stopped, but because I had finally decided I wouldn't. He thought I was trapped. But he had no idea what was coming. I had always believed that people like Richard couldn't be beaten. Men who built their power on intimidation and charm always seemed to land on their feet. But after weeks of collecting evidence and listening to neighbors' stories, I finally understood something: his power wasn't real. It was a performance. Smoke and mirrors. The moment anyone pulled back the curtain, he'd have nothing. The trick was doing it in a way that couldn't be twisted back on me. Richard was a master at turning accusations into lies, at twisting victims into villains. If I was going to end this, I needed to strike so publicly, so clearly, that even he couldn't spin it. The opportunity came in the form of the next HOA meeting. He had scheduled it to address serious disruptions caused by residents unwilling to follow community rules. I knew exactly who he meant. Me. I spent the week preparing. My dining table became a war room. Documents spread across the surface, violation notices, texts, emails, financial records. I rehearsed what I would say, edited it, and rehearsed again. Every word had to be exact. Every piece of evidence had to line up. Because I wasn't just going after him for myself, I was going after him for everyone he had cornered, bullied, or silenced. The night of the meeting, my stomach twisted as I walked into the clubhouse. The room was full, more crowded than usual. I felt the stares on me immediately, whispers fluttering through the air. Richard stood at the front, looking confident, polished as always, his smile calculated to disarm. When he saw me, it shifted just slightly into a smirk. The meeting began, and Richard wasted no time. We've had growing issues with non-compliance in the community, he announced. One homeowner in particular has repeatedly ignored notices, accrued significant fines, and created a hostile atmosphere for her neighbors. He didn't say my name, but everyone knew. He raised his voice just enough for the words to echo, for the judgment to stick. I stood slowly, my hands steady even though my heart pounded. Actually, I said, my voice sharper than I expected, I'd like to address that. The room grew quiet. Richard tilted his head, pretending to be patient, though his eyes narrowed. Go ahead, Emily, he said, voice dripping with condescension. I walked to the front of the room, carrying a thick folder. For months, I've been accused of violations that don't exist. I've been fined for things as absurd as where I placed my garbage can, for gatherings that never happened, even for the color of my front door, though it meets the exact guidelines of this HOA. At first, I thought I was alone. But I wasn't. Richard has been doing this to others for years. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Richard laughed lightly, raising his hands. Let's not get carried away with conspiracy theories. I opened the folder and began pulling out papers. These are copies of every notice I've received. You'll notice many are duplicated, some even contradictory. Here are the text messages he sent me, threatening me, pressuring me. I held up the screenshots, enlarged and printed for everyone to see. And here are the HOA financial records, showing payments that don't match approved budgets. Funds misused. Repairs billed but never completed. Money gone with no explanation. Murmurs turned into voices. People leaned forward, snatching at the papers as I passed copies around. Some faces turned red with anger, others pale with realization. Richard's mask began to crack. His smile faltered, his jaw tightening. This is outrageous. She's lying. She's manipulating documents. But I wasn't done. And I'm not the only one. Neighbors, if you've been targeted, if you've been harassed or fined unfairly, stand up. For a moment, silence. Then a chair scraped against the floor. Harris stood. His voice was steady. He fined me for a shed I'd had for years. Said it wasn't approved. Threatened foreclosure. Another neighbor stood. He accused me of damaging common property that was already broken. Cost me hundreds. One by one, people rose, voices layering over each other, filling the room with stories of intimidation, lies, and manipulation. The tide had turned. Richard's power crumbled in real time, his control slipping through his fingers as the very people he had ruled with fear began to see him clearly. I pulled out the final piece of evidence. An anonymous email, forwarded to me weeks ago. Attached was a receipt, a charge to the HOA account for a weekend retreat at a luxury hotel. The guest listed? Richard and his wife. The room type? A honeymoon suite. The expense filed as community development. The room exploded. Neighbors shouted over each other, some calling for his resignation, others demanding legal action. Richard's face burned red, his voice drowned out by outrage. He slammed his hands on the table, trying to regain control, but no one was listening anymore. For the first time since I had moved in, I wasn't the one being silenced. He was. By the end of the meeting, the board voted to suspend him pending investigation. His allies, those who had always backed him, kept their eyes down, refusing to defend him. He stormed out, his composure shattered, his reign broken. But it wasn't over. The evidence I'd gathered didn't just destroy him in the court of public opinion, it became the basis for a legal investigation. Fraud, embezzlement, abuse of power. The walls he had built to trap others became the cage that closed around him. The neighborhood slowly began to heal. Neighbors who had once avoided me now stopped by to talk, to apologize, to thank me. Harris told me he hadn't seen the community this united in years. People began sharing ideas for improvements, things they had been too afraid to suggest before. For the first time, the HOA felt like what it was supposed to be, a group of neighbors working together, not a weapon used against us. As for Richard, I heard bits and pieces. His wife left him. His position was gone. Legal troubles mounted. The man who had once seemed untouchable was now just another scandal, another name disgraced by his own arrogance. And me? I stayed. I refused to let him take my home from me. Every time I walked through the neighborhood, I reminded myself that I hadn't just survived him, I had beaten him. Sometimes, late at night, I think back to those first days, when I believed his smile, when I mistook his charm for kindness. I think about how close I came to giving up, to walking away. And I realize now that moving here wasn't a mistake. It was a test. A brutal, terrifying test. But I passed it. Richard thought he had trapped me. Thought he had written my story. But in the end, I wrote my own. And it wasn't one of defeat. It was one of revenge. I survived his trap, exposed the lies, and took back control of my life. If you've ever been betrayed or manipulated, remember, revenge isn't just about payback, it's about reclaiming your power. Subscribe now for more shocking true revenge stories, and see how justice can finally be served.